Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel Baylor. We're still seeing a couple people pop on, but we're going to get started. This is the Trauma-Informed Social Worker webinar today, being hosted by McSilver Institute along with the Community Technical Assistance Center and Managed Care Technical Assistance Center. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to our WebEx systems, just so you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noise that may distract others from listening to the presentation today. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to our host, which is indicated in the sidebar, and she'll be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to participate with us today using the chat box feature, which might be located at the bottom of your screen, or you'll see it on the right-hand side of the screen. You can submit your questions for us in that chat box throughout the presentation, and you will be asked to participate in a poll question. This will pop up for you to check out the answers. Once again, thank you for joining us. So I'd like to introduce the group of presenters that we have today, including myself. My name is Isabel Baylor. I'm an MSW candidate here at NYU, New York University, and I am an intern at the McSilver Center Institute for Poverty and Policy, working with the Community Technical Assistance Center and Managed Care Technical Assistance Center. I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves. First up, we have Jim Rodriguez.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Rodriguez, and I'm a senior research scientist here at McSilver Institute. Very happy to be Isabel's supervisor for her internship as well. And I'm also I'm affiliated with the Community Technical Assistance Center. I do training and technical assistance on a number of topics, but largely trauma-informed care. And I'm also an LCSW and licensed clinical psychologist in private practice and do a lot of work in trauma in my private practice as well.
Hi, everyone. This is Cara Dina Sale, and I am a social worker here at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research, as well as the clinical lead of the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York State. And I've been working alongside Jim and Isabel to really create this webinar for you. I have a big interest around trauma and resilience and looking at the relationship between trauma and hunger, and really am excited to present with you today. And let's get started.
So to kick things off, we wanted to just wish everyone a happy National Social Workers Month. We know here on the webinar, we might not have all social workers, but we did want to recognize the social workers in the space. Some of you may or may not know, but National Professional Social Work Month in March 2019 is really an opportunity for social workers around the nation and world and their supporters to educate the public about the valuable contributions of this profession. Every day, the nation sees around 6,800,000 social workers work to empower and elevate millions of people, including some of the most vulnerable in our society. So now let's move on to the agenda. So for the next hour, we'll take you through what we've kind of come up with, the idea of what a trauma-informed social worker might be, what it might look like. We'll ask you what it means. As I said earlier, we want to make this an interactive webinar for you all. We'll talk about psychological trauma, ACEs, and the human stress response. We'll go through the trauma-informed care principles, safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support and mutual self-help, collaboration, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues, and then we'll move on to compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and we'll talk about next steps. So the first opportunity to have a conversation with us is just for you to chat in the name of your organization, your role, and any questions you may have for us that hopefully we'll be able to answer either throughout our presentation or when we get to the end. So thank you to those who are letting you know where you're coming from. Looks like we have some social workers, some mental health counselors, some case managers, so a wide variety of providers in this space, which is great. Although we're calling this a trauma-informed social worker presentation, this information can be applied to any provider really in any context. Okay,
Wow.
So moving on, we want to talk about the social work ethical standards. Really, ever since the beginning or its formal inauguration in the late 19th century, social work has always paid attention to social justice issues. But what makes social workers different from other mental health providers? I think the most important distinction is that social workers are educated to understand the intimate and complex connection between individual problems and the social context from which those issues arise. Social workers are educated from day one to understand environmental correlation with individual issues, and that long-term solutions to the conditions that create human suffering must be addressed in both the clinical space, but also in the institutions and the political and policy arenas. As you can see in the social work ethical standards, social justice and social change are clearly laid out as important pieces to this profession. So as we continue on, we'll really start to discuss the uniqueness of social workers in the trauma-informed care realm. We hope that this presentation really continues to highlight that and see how that becomes clear. So another opportunity to engage you all in conversation, we're kind of asking this question: what is a trauma-informed social worker? What does it mean to you? We hope this concept will become more clear as things continue, but as social workers frequently encounter clients with a history of trauma, a trauma-informed social worker may rely on the knowledge about trauma to respond to clients in ways that might convey respect, compassion, honor self-determination, and enable the rebuilding of healthy interpersonal skills and coping strategies. Let's see what you all said. It looks like we're getting some great responses. A social worker who understands the impact of trauma on a variety of levels and understands trauma through multiple worldviews. Some say that trauma-informed practice means having an understanding and responding to the ways that trauma affects a person's functioning, whatever that means in the social worker setting and capacity. Oh, this is a great one. Not re-traumatizing, working with the root of the behavior. Someone who understands that trauma comes also at institutional levels, at government levels, and institutions that are meant to serve, but sometimes end up harming. These are great. Thank you. So we're going to continue on.
Yeah, so we have a poll for you. We have a poll question that we wanted to ask you. So we have some questions here, and in many ways, when we talk about trauma-informed care, as many of your comments have spoken to, we're talking about a mindset, and these are just some questions. We wanted to get a sense from you all of your perspective on trauma-informed care and some of your beliefs about the work that you do. So if you could take a moment to finish. So there's 2 options for each question, and we're going to sort of let you answer these questions and take a poll of the group and then respond. Take a moment to complete it. Just waiting for it to tabulate, and then we'll share out what folks have said. So it's still tabulating, and then we'll see. So here we go. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of, in the first question, right, do people act better if they wanted to, sort of, or do you believe, or people do the best they can? Again, a lot of agreement with that second option. Whether you believe in focusing on developing healthy, healing relationships versus rules and consequences. Again, a lot of agreement with that first option that focuses on how we think about the folks that we work with and how our system should be set up. So in many ways, a lot of these responses are, as we suspected, consistent with the trauma-informed care, understanding how our systems are set up, how our rules and procedures are set up, how we view our clients and how they handle things in their lives. And so in many ways, a lot of attitudes and beliefs consistent with the trauma-informed approach in this group.
So I'll just leave this slide up for you for a couple of minutes. We're going to just take a look at some of the common views or the traditional views used in interacting with clients in different mental health settings, and then shifting to the more trauma-informed focus. For instance, using labels to describe people, right, as borderline, describing them as their diagnosis. That is kind of a more common or traditional views, rather than shifting to reframing their behavior and trying to identify strategies and strengths that they might embody. Another example is, rather than creating systems that might make people work for support or work for help, shifting towards all people receiving support regardless of their needs. And the last one that we'll talk about later on is, in a traditional view or a common view, we often think of staff as the focal point, but in trauma-informed care, we care about both the staff-centered environment and the person-centered environment. Next up, we'll shift things over to Jim to talk about psychological trauma, ACEs, and the human stress response.
Thank you, Isabel. So again, you know, part of, and some of the folks on the responses mentioned having an understanding of trauma, and so this may be review for many folks, but we also think it's critically important to understand, you know, what trauma is and how it works into trauma-informed care. So very simply, I need to pull. Sorry. So 1 second. Well, okay, thank you. So when we think about trauma, we think about the 3 E's. So I'm going to talk and reference SAMHSA a lot. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has done a lot of work in the area of trauma-informed care, providing resources and information and really distilling the information that we know about trauma to mental health providers and providers across the board. And so one of the things that SAMHSA talks about is understanding the 3 E's of trauma, beginning with external causes or events that can take place. These are events that can be sudden, unexpected, or extreme, but they can also be circumstances, exposure to chronic stress. It could be witnessing horrifying events or living under conditions that are highly stressful. So that's obviously the critical feature. One of the reasons why it's important to recognize the external events is because if external events can cause it, oftentimes when we talk about trauma-informed care, changing and modifying the external environment to support people who have been exposed is critically important, as many folks have mentioned. The second thing that's important to understand is it's the individual experience that one has with regards to or in response to those traumatic events. It's the subjective experience that is the critical feature to understanding trauma. So oftentimes when a person experiences things outside of the scope of their control or exceeding their capacity to cope effectively, either with a single event that may have taken place or being exposed to chronic stressors, the person can experience extreme and profound effects, which is the 3rd E. But that 2nd E is the critical piece because oftentimes, and it's also what explains why some people or 2 people can be exposed to the same exact event or set of circumstances, and one person can come away feeling or relatively less affected, and someone can come away with some serious effects. So that individual subjective experience of the event is critical for understanding trauma and its effect. So when we think about trauma and adversity, historically, the early work in the field of trauma focused a lot on combat fatigue and soldiers who were exposed to military combat. But, and so for many years, one myth that existed about trauma was that only soldiers could be affected by trauma and in the manifestation of post-traumatic stress disorder. But of course, as time went on, folks doing work with rape victims realized that they often experienced the same symptoms that combat veterans experienced with PTSD. And so over time, our conceptions about trauma have changed, and the kinds of exposures that people can have in their lives that lead to negative outcomes has expanded. And so now we know that there are many different things that can lead to post-traumatic stress and other stress-related disorders and other mental illness. As the work has progressed, I'm going to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences. So as the work has developed over time, a very critical and essential study that was done in the area of trauma and adversity was the ACEs study. Many folks may already understand, but for those of you who don't, and I should also mention, we have a learning module with more information about ACEs, and if you want deeper information, you can access it at lms.ctacny.org. But briefly, the ACEs study was conducted in San Diego by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, a large healthcare provider in California, with over 17,000 people who were asked about early childhood exposure to adversity, things like abuse, neglect, sexual abuse being raised by a parent with mental illness or a parent who uses substances or having an incarcerated parent. And so what they did was they added up all of those various adversities that one could be exposed to, and they correlated them with health, mental health, and other health behavioral outcomes in adulthood, and what they found was astounding. The visual that you see here demonstrates some of the outcomes, but what they found was as the number of exposures to adverse childhood experience increased, there were negative outcomes that also the probability of negative outcomes increased as well. And so as this slide sort of indicates, you see many of the outcomes that can occur when you begin to sort of reach the level of higher ACEs. Typically 4 or more ACEs, but oftentimes it wasn't unusual for people to be exposed to 5 or 6, 7, sometimes 10 ACEs. But as you increase, you could have greater likelihood of experiencing or using alcohol, sexually transmitted diseases, injection drug use. Suicide rates were incredibly high among people with ACE scores of 6 or more. Also health-related problems like smoking, problems with jobs, experiencing depression. So, and this is only a small sample of the many negative outcomes that were associated with ACEs exposure. And so oftentimes we get the question when we do training in trauma-informed care and talk about ACEs, we get the question around the impact of poverty. So one of the things that's important to understand about the original ACEs study was it was done on a largely white, middle-class, educated sample of folks from San Diego in California. But subsequent studies have been done using ACEs or ACEs-type questionnaires. The one that was most notable is the Philadelphia ACEs study. And in the Philadelphia ACEs study, they similarly found, so the Philadelphia ACEs study was done with a sample, a more ethnically and racially diverse sample, a more socioeconomically diverse sample. And as you can see from this table, you can see rates of exposure to adverse childhood events were much higher in the urban, more socioeconomically and racially diverse sample. What was also important to understand about both the original ACEs study and the Philadelphia study is that in both studies they found ACEs to be extremely common in the community. In San Diego, for example, they found 64% of people experienced at least one ACE in their life. 25 experienced 2 or more ACEs, and another 6%. In the Philadelphia study, those numbers were much higher. 70% of people in Philadelphia experienced at least one ACE. 40% experienced at least 4 or more ACEs. But it's important to understand that in the Philadelphia study, they had an expanded list of ACEs as well. So, and why that's critically important is this is a list of some of the additional ACEs that they examined in the Philadelphia study. For example, witnessing community violence, feeling or experiencing discrimination and racism, having adverse neighborhood experiences like growing up in poverty or growing up in neighborhoods that were under-resourced or poverty impacted, being bullied, or living in foster care. So they expanded the number of ACEs, which is why you see a greater number of folks experiencing 4 or more ACEs. But at the same time, they looked at very different additional ACEs. And in many ways, the discussion around increased ACEs continues in the mental health field and social services field. The last thing that's important to understand about ACEs is that despite the research that we have in community samples, or I should say beyond the community samples that we see, where we see high rates of exposure to toxic stress and adversity, what we know is, of course, in the service systems that you all work with, these rates are even much higher. In substance abuse programs, in mental health programs, in residential programs, in child welfare programs, those rates of exposure to high adversity are much higher. So trauma-informed care, and so we talk about other forms of ACEs that folks can experience as we expand the number of adverse experiences and exposures to possible toxic stress. The other thing that's important to understand about ACEs is that it's led folks to think about, more broadly, what are the conditions that can create these adverse childhood experiences. So researchers at George Washington University conducted interviews with providers and experts in trauma and community partners to identify ways of helping people overcome exposure to trauma and chronic stress. And so they've developed this graphic, the Pair of ACEs tree image, that illustrates the relationship between adversity in families and adverse conditions in the community. So while adverse experiences within the family can contribute to negative outcomes, adverse community environments such as racism and discrimination, lack of economic opportunity, homelessness and housing, violence, all of these things can either compound or actually directly contribute to adversity or compound the negative effects of adversity that families and individuals may experience. I'm going to turn it over to Kara to talk a little bit about the human stress response.
Thank you, Jim. Hi, everyone. We're going to just shift gears just a little bit and talk about the experiences of those events, those trauma events. The experiences of those events really begins in our bodies and engages what we call our human stress response. And these experiences really begin in our brain. So what you see here is the limbic system. This is an area of our brain that really helps us to process stressful events. And so all of this happens really quickly in our brains. And basically what it triggers the amygdala and our hippocampus. So we could talk for hours about all of these intricacies around what happens in our brain, but the really quick and dirty of it is that it starts in our amygdala and our hippocampus. So if something is seen as a trigger or a threat, the amygdala triggers a fight-flight response in the brain, and then it tells the hippocampus to remember everything about it. And so after the amygdala triggers a fight-flight, the hypothalamus carries it out, and it sends a message to our adrenal glands to release adrenaline and cortisol. And so I'm going to just show you really quickly this is what happens in our bodies. So the responses are activated when we experience stress, and it's important to know that the stress can be from external circumstances, but it could also be from internal worry or internal thoughts and experiences. And chemicals such as adrenaline, noradrenaline, or cortisol are released into our bloodstream, and this response actually corresponds to our brain, as I mentioned, and it increases our heart rate and blood pressure. It constricts our blood vessels. It affects our respiration rates, where our respiration rates increase, our bronchial tubes dilate, our pupils dilate, our digestive system is affected, so our digestive system actually stops and slows down. Our hormones are affected, and so all of this happens really to help us survive. And so it's really important to know that our bodies have an amazing way of helping us to survive and stay alive when there's some kind of threat perceived. And so what happens, and then this is usually what happens in our world as social workers, is that we see the fight, flight, freeze responses in response to high threat. And this is what you may see. So, for example, fight may be irritability, loss of temper, defensiveness. Flight may be avoidance, anxiety, fear. And then freeze may be where people just numb or detach or give up easily. I typically freeze when there's high stress around. But I wanted to show you really quickly. This is, and these resources we're going to give to you at the end. This is a really great handout by some authors, Hopper, et cetera, around looking at trauma and homeless services. And so these on the left are difficult behaviors that you may sometimes see, and then on the right are those trauma reactions. And so similar to what Isabel was explaining earlier on, this again is something that you may see. So for example, someone who may isolate within the shelter, stay away from other residents and staff, really may be feeling detached from others. And so that fight, flight, or freeze response may be easily triggered in ways that we're not always aware of. And so part of being a trauma-informed social worker is understanding these processes and those events, those experiences of the events and the effects. And so, and then just to summarize, there's what this is talking about. I'm going to let Jim take over, but this is really about the impact of toxic stress, that it really is a cycle.
And so summarizing what Kara has said, early toxic stress can lead to an overactive or an exposure, I should say, to chronic fight, flight, or freeze situations that increases cortisol levels and really changes the neuroendocrine system, the neurobiological system in many ways, and the way our bodies respond to human stress. And that over time, that hyper-responsiveness to stress can increase over time, cascade over time, and lead to more chronic stress. So when we talk about exposure to early chronic stress, we're also talking about the likelihood that oftentimes it leads to later reactions that can exacerbate or compound people's exposure to chronic stress. So now we want to move into the principles of trauma-informed care and talking about what trauma-informed care looks like and how to apply it to the folks that we work with. Critically important, why it's important to become a trauma-informed social worker. As this is in a large part review, Isabel talked a little bit about that, but oftentimes we focus on social change, not just viewing the individual as the locus of the problem, but understanding the social structures that are in place that can impact people's exposure to stressful and toxic situations. We focus on vulnerable populations and understanding the impact of racism and discrimination. We also want to focus a lot on the importance of safety, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. And as Isabel said, understanding the social environment and how it can impact individuals, and more increasing the quality of services to ensure that they're trauma-informed. And also creating communities of hope and health, healing, and recovery. And so these are, again, going back to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA has developed the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. What we're going to do is walk through the 6 principles of trauma-informed care, but what we thought would be helpful is to use a person who we work with to apply those principles. So we'd like to introduce you to Joe. Joe is not necessarily a specific person that any one of us has worked with, but a composite of folks that we've worked with in the past. And we'll talk about applying the principles of trauma-informed care for Joe. So Joe is presenting problems. These may be typical presenting problems that folks come to services for: sleeping and attending appointments for other services, getting to work on time, inability to concentrate, substance use, and problems controlling her anger. These are some of the issues that she may come in with. She's a single mom with 3 children, 4, 8, and 12 years old, and she's currently living in a family shelter. And a brief psychosocial on Joe. Joe was one of 2 siblings and was raised by her mother from Puerto Rico and stepfather from Jamaica in a poverty-impacted neighborhood. And she left home at the age of 17. After she left home, she moved in with an older boyfriend whom she broke up with 3 years later. She completed her GED and applied to college in nursing, but declined as she was pregnant with her first child. So Joe was recently in a difficult relationship with her new boyfriend and had to move to a shelter. She is currently looking for permanent housing. So we'll apply the principles of trauma-informed care, but in many ways, as you can see, there's many clues, of course. So one of the things that we talk about with trauma-informed care is always assuming that someone may have trauma in their past. And in this particular case with Joe, obviously, given many of the indicators that we have in there, that assumption can be increased dramatically. So as we think about safety, the first principle of trauma-informed care is creating a safe, psychologically and physically safe environment. So that exists throughout the organization. Staff and the people they serve feel physically and emotionally and psychologically safe. So what I'd like you to do is chat in quickly. How would you go about creating a safe space with Joe? What are some of the things that you think are critical in creating a safe space with Joe? We're going to give you about 10 seconds to respond, and then we'll include your responses in some of the points that we want to cover in a second. Of course, the other thing I want to highlight is, again, safety is critical. What we want to do is, and this is somebody commented earlier, the notion of doing no harm, universal precautions, right? Not re-traumatizing folks. Okay. So I see a number of responses coming in. I'm going to go through these, and then Carol will share some of your responses. But in terms of creating safety with Joe, very simply discussing and centering safety, asking the question, what makes you feel safe? What does safety look like to you? What does it feel like to you? All of these things. Of course, using calming tones, your voice and how you present yourself, respectful language and listening skills early on. But also thinking about the physical environment. So setting up your office so that the person has an easy way to leave the office. And I use my example in my private practice. I have all of my clients sitting closer to the door and with the door available to them so that they feel safe. But then oftentimes, some of the ways in which we take information. Oftentimes when we're doing intakes, putting paper and pencil aside when someone raises the issue of adversity. I also want to point out here that those are just the universal precautions we should take for everyone. But in addition to that, oftentimes folks will disclose as they go about their work and talk about the adversity. So for me, it's also critically important to focus on gender and comfort around working with me as a male, for example, if I'm working with a female who I know has been exposed to either interpersonal violence or sexual violence. Engaging, oftentimes I will engage, and many of you may do this, engage folks in relaxation training or meditation techniques, but doing that with permission because people who've been exposed with adversity and trauma oftentimes have difficulty regulating themselves. That work is also a critical part of helping people build coping skills, but at the same time doing it with permission and allowing people to have a choice around that. And I often like to say providing options to having their eyes closed during meditative activities or mindfulness activities. And then the other piece that's important for creating safety is understanding and providing psychoeducation on trauma and stress. And the reason why that's important is because oftentimes actually processing that in sessions with folks to help them understand why they might feel nervous even in the setting that they're in, if they're working with you, how they might feel triggered, understanding how all of that can play out in the work that you're doing with them and helping them make that connection. What were some of the things that people said, Kara?
Yeah, people said pretty much all of these things. I do want to add something that quite a few people mentioned that I think is really important, and that's actually creating a safety plan with Jo. And so I think that's a really important contribution to creating safety in regards to her history and perhaps her safety in this current relationship. So that's really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for all that you've chatted in. It's wonderful. A lot of people are saying build empathy, build that rapport, give Jo space and choices, which is amazing. Thank you.
Yep. So again, in working with Jo, this is not unusual in my work, in our work with folks. So using basic history taking, oftentimes, and again, as folks already mentioned, using basic listening techniques and skills, being empathic, allowing folks to tell their stories. So these are some things that Jo has disclosed as a result of simply listening and allowing folks to tell their story. So Jo has shared that she was sexually abused by an uncle at the age of 10. Her mother had a substance abuse problem and suffered from severe depression. And her father was incarcerated, and she has had little contact with him. So oftentimes, and the reason why I say this is because oftentimes a practice that is slowly making its way into common practice is using ACEs questionnaires as a way of collecting information from folks to identify possible exposure to adversity. But oftentimes, we don't even need those to sort of be able to get a good picture of someone's ACEs history. So in addition to Jo's ACEs score of 4, she was also placed in foster care for 6 months and grew up in poverty. All of these things speak to a history of exposure to toxic stress or the likelihood that there was high exposure to toxic stress. Moving into building trustworthiness and transparency. Decisions, in order to build trustworthiness and transparency, decisions are made with transparency and with the goal of building and maintaining trust among staff, clients, family members, and those receiving services. So again, question for you, how do you express or how do we try to build trust and transparency with Jo's? Some of your thoughts. And we'll take 10 seconds to have you share some of those. Okay. So, in work with Jo, building transparency and trust, In many ways, it's important to continue to highlight the importance of safety in coming to the setting. And I also say that in relation to her disclosures, right? So as folks disclose in the work that you're doing with them and you learn more about their history of adversity or exposure to chronic stress, repeating and continually to talk about safety helps to build the trust. But some of the other things, reviewing ACEs and discussing the importance of ACEs, this sends the message that your information is important to me, creating a space where they feel safe enough that you can handle the trauma and adversity that they're talking to you about and sharing about. I also think it's important for me, so a lot of the work that I do is in trauma. I'm a CBT trained therapist. And it doesn't matter what orientation you come from, but I think it is important to clarify your position on how you address trauma and adversity in the work that you do. I will often talk about CBT as my approach, but regardless of what orientation you use, it's important to discuss how you plan on including discussions about trauma and adversity in the work that you do. Also, exploring expectations. For example, asking a very simple question: if services are helpful to you, what would that look like? And then exploring experiences, past experiences with mental health services and the degree in which trauma and ACEs has been explored. Oftentimes, I've worked with many people with extensive trauma histories or histories of toxic stress, and have come to me and said they've been in mental health services before and the issue was never brought up or never discussed in treatment. It's always important to address that question as well. And then, of course, sometimes the way we can build trust is to accommodate people's schedules whenever that's possible. If it's possible to change your schedule, understanding that folks who have been exposed to chronic stress as young people may continue to be exposed to chronic stress as adults. And oftentimes we have to try to accommodate them in our work. What were some things that folks shared, Tara?
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, everyone shared pretty much what you were saying. I think something to add that was really wonderful was around reminding Joe about confidentiality, as well as reminding if you're going to say something to Joe that you're consistent and that you follow through. So you have to keep your word and all of those important functions around really building trust within your relationship. So consistency, keeping your word, as well as everything else that you said, Jim.
Those are wonderful additions. And then moving on very quickly, peer support and mutual self-help. Peer support and mutual self-help is an important principle because what we understand about trauma is that oftentimes people with lived experience of trauma can often be the best source of support and help and guidance. Even more so than therapists and professionals. And so peer support identifies the integral and important aspect of service delivery and understanding that that can be an important aspect of building trust and establishing safety and empowerment for folks. It's connecting folks who have lived experience. So folks, chat in. What are some other ways in which we can incorporate peer support and mutual self-help in the work that we do with folks? Take 10 seconds. Okay, and I'm just going to move on. So some things that are really important: routinely discussing and exploring issues of social supports. What social supports do you have? Where do you get the social supports? And understanding positive and negative social supports to get an idea of to what degree peers and families are supportive. Discussing the risks of social isolation. Again, folks who've gone through trauma or been exposed to toxic stress, it's not unusual for them to isolate and withdraw, especially in social situations. So talking about the risks of isolation and helping them to identify ways in which they can connect with others. And then considering referrals to family and peer advocates. Of course, if someone has a history of interpersonal violence or domestic violence or sexual abuse, referring them to groups for survivors of domestic violence or sexual abuse, or again, for those of you who may not do treatment, referring them to treatment for trauma and groups that address trauma, and also groups for parents of young children who've been affected by violence. And then demonstrating respect for and readiness for group. In other words, preparing folks to be able to take advantage of and join groups that may be working on issues of trauma and adversity. And then, of course, assisting with follow-up and referrals and helping folks get to where they need to get that mutual support. Kara?
Everyone said exactly this: refer to groups and support that referral. One addition is around creating an eco map with Joe, and that's really, eco maps are incredibly helpful around identifying support and helping your participant participate in that support.
Fantastic. So I'm going to turn it over to Isabel. She's going to talk a little bit of collaboration and mutuality.
Mm-hmm. So with collaboration and mutuality, really there's this true sense of partnering and leveling of power differences between staff and clients. And that's not just among the provider themselves and the client, but really among the entire organization staff, from the direct care staff to the administrators to the support staff, janitorial staff, whatever it is. There's this recognition that healing happens in relationships and in the meaningful sharing of power and decision making. One way to do this is really the organization recognizing that everyone has a role to play in trauma-informed approach, and one does not have to be specific to that therapeutic relationship. So shifting the conversation back to Joe, how might we incorporate collaboration and mutuality in our treatment and care and collaboration with Joe? I'll give you guys about 10 seconds. Some ways that we might incorporate collaboration and mutuality with Joe is really emphasizing hope often, especially in the context of discussion and adversity. I think, yes, emphasizing hope, but also validating their experience, their traumatic history or traumatic experiences that have brought them to where they are. I think create and prioritize treatment goals together, really creating this climate of we, oftentimes instead of using the words like helping or serving, really it's a partnership. Your relationship with clients is more as like that partnership, partnering together to create goals. And really reinforcing a shared experience. So I can help people cope and talk about their adversity, and she is really the expert on her experiences and what she knows to be most helpful. I'll turn it over to Kara to fill us in on what you all are saying.
The additions are around writing notes together and creating agendas for your time together together as well, which I think is really helpful in showing that ongoing collaboration and mutuality.
Fantastic. Those are wonderful recommendations.
Great. We'll shift it over to the next principle, which is empowerment, voice, and choice. So for this one, we're focusing on the individual strengths and really building on those, validating their new skills and developing new skills as necessary. Every really individual is considered unique and they have an individualized plan. So there is not going to be one set formula or one set goal that is going to work for Joe. And it's going to differ when she sees different people, when she's interacting with different institutions, and then really a set belief in resilience and that people can overcome and survive and thrive through building this sense of resilience. Let's check out what everyone is saying in terms of how we can empower and raise Joe's voice and provide her with more choice. How might we do that?
Quick 10 seconds. Okay.
So we'd shift the creating empowerment, voice, and choice with Joe by really focusing on her strengths. You know, she has had a number of adverse experiences personally, but also being within her community. And how can we focus on the strengths that she has used to take her this far? What has helped her in the past to cope with trauma and adversity? Really providing her a variety of treatment strategies and choice about direction and focus of treatment. So not just focusing on program goals, but also life goals, what might be goals for her family or for her future. And some other ones are emphasizing the limits of control, letting her know that, she can only control what happens to her and her behavior and her own experience. I'll turn it over to Kara to fill us in on what you all said about creating empowerment, voice, and choice for Jo.
Pretty much the same thing, Isabel and Jem. I think one addition is around really using motivational interviewing techniques to help empower Jo, as well as reminding her that she's the expert. She's expert on her own experiences, and that you, as her provider, can be the expert on some things that may be helpful, but she's the expert on her experiences and reminding her of that and how important that is, as well as just maybe exploring some of her talents and some of her goals, like the life role goals, as people mentioned a lot as well.
Fantastic. And then lastly.
So we'll be focusing also on the cultural, historical, and gender issues. So thinking about moving beyond or past cultural stereotypes and biases, also moving beyond the notion of cultural competence to looking at power and oppression, really the effect of social identity on an individual or a community's worldview. For instance, we know that researchers have found that psychological impacts of discrimination for individuals from disenfranchised communities include higher levels of psychological distress, which Jim talked about earlier, lower levels of life satisfaction, and lower emotional well-being. Systematic oppression can be a form of trauma, despite the fact that it would rarely meet the narrow DSM criteria for a traumatic event. So really incorporating that cultural responsiveness, not necessarily having to learn about every single culture to be culturally competent, but rather allowing your client to teach you through their experience, through active listening, not necessarily asking them to teach you about their culture. And then being aware of power and privilege, whether that is historical and generational trauma, or other experiences of trauma, which can be transmitted from one generation to the next. Speaking further about this generational trauma, really this intersection between systematic oppression, trauma, and intergenerational trauma for individuals who are from historically experienced groups that are discriminated against. One example might be that of intergenerational trauma is for African American communities, really are descendants of slaves, and really how that intersects with present day racism that may increase trauma among African Americans. Or there has been a lot of research on the trauma of children of Holocaust survivors, which took place actually in the 1960s, in which clinicians noted that symptoms of trauma were present in children, even though their parents, not them, had been exposed directly to trauma. So some other ways, some other ways we might think about cultural, historical, and gender issues are really connecting the trauma and the adversity to an anti-racist or an anti-oppressive practice. Let's think about how we can attend to cultural, historical, and gender issues with Jo. So with these cultural, historical, and gender issues, attending to those with Joe, we might explore issues, of social identities and understanding the person and the experiences of oppression. This might look like validating and exploring those issues further, exploring her intersecting social identities and oppression as a woman of color, discussing how her trauma is really outside of themselves and intertwined in systems that they occupy. Discuss the significance and healing of meaning of culture in defining the problem and in healing. So really looking at how interventions can be ingrained in a community context and utilizing culturally responsive healing practices. And lastly, really connecting the adversity to ACEs, not necessarily to culture, exploring her experiences with intimate partner violence, and exploring intergenerational exposure to trauma and stress, which we talked about earlier. So us as clinicians, we should really examine the individual, family, and community strengths to shift more towards a resilience-focused context to help Joe overcome this adversity.
Kara, so what did folks say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty much the same. A couple of things to add is around having discussions around systemic oppression in your sessions and how important that can be, as well as really being aware of your own biases. So having an understanding that we all have biases and how important it is to be aware of your own biases at all times when helping Joe and others.
Okay. Actually, this is just a summary slide, but I think we'll move on. And Kara, have you take us through the last piece in the very little time we have.
I know we don't have much time left. Sorry, everyone. This is really great. Thank you so much for all your participation. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about understanding compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout, because the reality is that one important component of being a trauma-informed social worker is really to deepen our understanding of trauma, not only in the people's lives that we work with, but also in our own lives, that we're not immune to trauma and experiences of trauma, not only in our own personal histories, but also in listening to the stories and listening to the experiences of the people we work with. And so this is a spectrum of the helper's experience. So we all start out with compassion satisfaction, where this is probably what brought a lot of us into the work, where we love helping people, we love empowering people and helping them make a difference in their own lives. And after time, it may go to and maybe experiencing vicarious trauma, so witnessing the experiences of people, actual people in their homes, or you may hear their stories. That begins to have you experience secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, or even compassion fatigue, where you're exhausted by the work, and then that can sometimes lead to burnout. And so I just want to spend a few seconds really talking about each of these, if I can, just really quickly, that compassion satisfaction, as I mentioned, is the positive aspects of helping. And that the reality is if you're good at your job, you are probably at some point going to experience compassion fatigue. And so that's where you have some spiritual exhaustion, you're just feeling really tired, but that all of this points out to the need to really take care of ourselves. And so I'm just going to move ahead, and these slides are going to be available to you, and I'm happy to share more information. Just a few risk factors around what makes us more at risk for compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress or even burnout. And so if we have an experience working with trauma, that may put us more at risk. If we have a high degree of empathy, I always think that's so interesting and so true, that if we're more empathic, which a lot of us are, we may be more at risk for compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, et cetera. The degree to exposure, the countertransference, and our own personal history of trauma. And so it's important just to know these things to protect ourselves, right? As well as some of the symptoms that may occur around if we are experiencing compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, or even burnout. And so what I want to say is compassion fatigue is something that you may experience that comes and goes in our work, but burnout usually sticks around. And so if you're feeling burnout and you're feeling, and one of the signs and symptoms around burnout is really that we're feeling more critical of the people that we're helping, and we're being more judgmental and a little, we're just not feeling as good about the work at all, and you're kind of dreading going to work. But I think that's really an opportunity for us, and it's a sign for us to think about intervening and either getting support through our supervisor or our colleagues or even outside support. And so there's an amazing website called proqual.org. I don't want to bring it up. It's going to take too much time, but proqual.org is an amazing website that I want to direct you all to. It's called Professional Quality of Life, and it has some assessments around compassion fatigue and burnout that I really encourage everyone to take. They're self-assessments, and as a reminder, it can also be a way to help support yourself. So prevention strategies include increasing your self-care, increasing organizational opportunities for self-care, as well as increasing supervision as support in times of need. And so this as a big takeaway. This is from Audre Lorde. I've come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival. And I think that's really important. We are over our time, but we would love to just give 1 minute for any questions, any burning questions. You could also email us. So I'm just going to put up our emails for a second. We'd love to answer any of your questions now, or if you have additional questions, feel free to email any of us, and we'd love to communicate with you. Okay, another session would be great, somebody said. I know, we'd realized that this should have been a longer webinar. We're really sorry about that because... We had to make many choices about what to include, and we certainly could do more to cover. Yeah. So if you have any ideas about a part 2 that would be helpful, please email us those, and we'd be happy to think about a part 2 in the future. I want to say thank you so much to both Jim and Isabel. It's been a pleasure really presenting this webinar with them. And these are some of our upcoming events. You can also go to our website to view them as well. And we have several more that are coming down the pike. So stay tuned with us. And Jim or Isabel, do you have any final thoughts?
Nope, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. As Kara and Jim both said, we had so much information we wanted to include and would love your thoughts on what you would like to see next time. Please fill out the questionnaire at the end, the survey at the end, and let us know what more you would like in this area. Thank you so much, though. We really enjoyed doing this. Have a great day, everyone. Take good care. Bye-bye.